morning, everybody. Glad that everybody's here for the day 2 of the International Conference on Creativity, Emotion, and the Arts. Welcome, and we have another very exciting day of events. The first set of presentations this morning is on creativity and innovation at work, and we have 2 presenters. First will be Dr. Alexander McKay, who is an assistant professor of organizational behavior at Virginia Commonwealth University. And our second presenter will be Dr. Reiter-Palmon, who is a professor of industrial and organizational psychology at the University of Nebraska at Omaha, and the director of innovation for the Center of Collaborative Science, Interdisciplinary Center at the university. And they will be talking to us about all things creativity and work. So I welcome our speakers, and Alex is going to be first. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you for being here. My name is Alex McKay. I'm from Virginia Commonwealth University in the Department of Management Entrepreneurship. So this morning I'm going to talk to you about the role of affect in both social networks, so who we collaborate with, and also in team settings, and how that impacts creativity and innovation, primarily at work. So Zorana mentioned this yesterday, but in 2015, the World Economic Forum asked top executives and those in charge of hiring at 371 corporations across 9 different industries, what skills did workers need in 2015, and what will they need in 2020? In 2015, creativity was ranked as the 10th most important skill that workers needed, but for 2020, that increased and moved up to the 3rd most important skill for 2020. So we can see that creativity is growing in importance. Now, in addition to that, numbers 1 and 2, complex problem solving, critical thinking, and number 10, cognitive flexibility, are also closely related to creativity. So we can see that 4 out of the top 10 here are creativity or related to creativity in some way. Now, in addition to creativity, the collaborative element that goes into work is also growing substantially. Within science and collaboration for scientific articles, since 1955, teams were about an average of 2 people working together, and in 2000, there's about 3.5 authors collaborating together on a single publication, for example. So we can see this is growing as importance. In companies as well, people have reported spending as much as 80% of their time working collaboratively with other people, and in some cases, people have argued that the unit now within companies are teams. They're not people working alone. Instead, it's groups of people working together collectively to accomplish some sort of task. Now, when we go back to this top 10 list from the World Economic Forum, what we can see is that while 4 of them are specifically related to creativity, the other 6 deal with elements that deal with collaboration, that deal with emotional intelligence, and so forth. So basically, this top 10 list is all about creativity, collaboration, or emotions. So we can see that this is a pretty important part of today's workplace. So for today's talk, I'm going to kind of review the role of affect for both with collaborative creativity, focusing on these kind of social networks as well as with team settings as well. So I'm going to distinguish between 2 terms called intrapersonal affect and interpersonal affect, and then focus primarily on this interpersonal affect. And then I'm just going to discuss a couple quick practical implications, and in terms of some things we don't really know that much about yet that have a big impact within the workplace. So to kind of start off, distinguishing between intrapersonal affect and interpersonal affect, intrapersonal affect deals with affect within a person. So how does my mood, my emotions, and so forth impact my own performance, my behaviors, my motivation, my thoughts, and so forth? Zorana talked a little bit about this yesterday in her talk about how people's emotions impact their creative performance. So interpersonal affect, though, is a little bit different. This deals with affect and mood and emotions between people. So how does my mood state impact somebody else's cognitions, behaviors, and motivation? Or how does somebody else's emotions impact my cognition, behavior, and motivation? So kind of jumping into this affect in this interpersonal affect, what we very much know is that emotions and affect serve a very important social signal. If I show an expression of fear, it might signal that there's some sort of threat in this room where everybody else would sort of heighten their awareness and pay attention to what's going on. If I displayed happiness, other people would probably feel some sort of enjoyment and happiness as well. And what we do know is that emotions can occur at this collective level. Sort of groups working together can kind of experience and feel the same emotions as one another and kind of reach some sort of harmony in terms of their emotional expressions. So jumping into kind of work and social relationships, we know that affect plays an important role in terms of us forming and creating and maintaining relationships with other people, who we collaborate with, who we spend our time with, and so forth. Some of this is due to what's called emotional contagion. If somebody's smiling, it puts us in a better mood and we're more likely to approach and talk to those people, and so forth. Now, in addition to that, it also impacts who we continually maintain and spend our times with as well. And what's kind of referred to as strength of ties, or kind of strength of relationships with other people. And there's kind of three main types. One of which are weak ties, which are people we don't collaborate with very often, we've only known for a short amount of time, and we're not that emotionally close with. We just don't know them that well, but we do interact with them from time to time. Now, strong ties are people we've known for a long time, people we talk to frequently, and people we are very emotionally close with. People that we're very strong trust and engagement with in that regard. Now, super ties are kind of an extreme and unique case of strong ties. They're people we collaborate with potentially across our entire career. We're very close with them. We trust them very, very strongly, and they play a very important role. So to kind of illustrate this as well, this is a giant social network of a lot of creativity researchers, pretty much everybody who's here and many more. So this is all collaborations in over 200 academic journals. And this is just even a small subset of all of that. It's only about 1,700 people with about 4,500 collaborations. And everybody within this group has collaborated with at least one other person in the group. So now the colors in this represent different groups that collaborate with each other more regularly. So if you see consistency in the same colors, those people are ones who are working together more often. Now the sides of the different nodes, as they're called, or little dots, represent who even spans across some of those different groups. So you can see there are some people that have a larger one and they kind of collaborate with a lot of different people. Now you can see a lot of instances here as well. So these two red dots, this large one and this one right here. This one's Ronnie Reiter-Palmon right here, and this other one is James Kaufman, who you heard yesterday. And they've collaborated with each other 14 times. So they're more of kind of super ties in many cases, people who collaborate with each other very regularly. And there's very many other kind of instances in here as well. People have collaborated a few times with each other, people who may even never have collaborated, but still have interacted and talked to one another. So now all of the research that's been done kind of on these different social relationships in terms of collaboration, who talks to who at work and communicates with, kind of has shown a fair amount of evidence for how these ties kind of impact people's creativity and innovative performance. So weak ties generally do help somewhat with idea generation and getting diverse knowledge. Talking to people you don't normally talk to can be a way to get things or ideas that you've never heard before. Typically, people might be in a different department at work, or just people you just don't interact with as often. Now, strong ties typically have demonstrated more of a stronger relationship with creative performance, actually. Now, these people really help out with idea implementation. If you have an idea that you're trying to work on and get put into practice, these people can play a big role in terms of getting buy-in from management and other people within the company, and play an important role in terms of getting support. So this emotional closeness and this trust can play a very important role. In addition to that, if you have highly original, wild ideas, they can be a really great group of people to discuss those with. Now, super ties can play an important role in terms of long-term collaborative partners across one's entire career. So I could really talk about this all day. This is more my research area and interest, but it's also very important to kind of talk about teams and creativity as well. Because those one-on-one relationships that I mentioned are often embedded and a part of larger teams, groups of 4 or 5, potentially even more, working within companies on some sort of bigger issue. And teams can and do have a collective affect between them. And there's kind of two ways of approaching and studying this and how this sort of comes about. One is sort of top-down influences, whether or not there's some collective group or collective influence on each individual person. Sometimes that's more impacted by the culture within the company, and leaders play an important role, and Ronnie will kind of talk more about that when she gives her talk. But there's also these bottom-up processes, whether each individual person's kind of sum together, and the whole is kind of the sum of its parts, where each person sort of impacts what's called the affective tone, and whether or not then if people will converge and feel the same way, or potentially diverge and feel a different way from one another. So when it comes down to this convergence or divergence, there are different aspects that kind of drive this. So in a book chapter that's coming out in a book I'm working on with Ronnie and James on team creativity, there are a number of different aspects that sort of drive this as well. So Kyle Emmich and Lou Lee sort of discuss this, and they view sort of three aspects that lead people to more likely converge in their emotions. It can be contextual processes, different norms within the group, also shared experiences. Since people are together more often in a group, they more likely might experience and reach the same emotional states through those experiences. It can also be through individual differences, how much empathy they have towards other people, how much they can manage and influence others' emotions, and how much their own emotions can be influenced, as well as automatic processes, the emotional contagion, or just mimicking other people. Now, while these will help people converge, there are also things that might kind of separate people so they feel different emotions in the group. This can be kind of contextual aspects, different roles and hierarchies within the team as well. And it can also be these individual differences and traits as well. Different personality traits may lead people to kind of feel differently from one another versus coming together. In addition to that, might be unshared experiences. On the way to work, somebody may get a speeding ticket or have some sort of rough encounter with someone else, or just something that might lead them to join the group feeling more frustrated and so forth, whereas everybody else might be in a more positive, happier mood. So then jumping into looking at what happens when teams converge on emotions. And there's kind of typically two ways of looking at this. Positive affective tone convergence, which means it's kind of sort of the average positive mood of everyone within the team. And negative affective tone, so the average mood of everyone for negative affect within the team. Now, generally positive affect for collective groups is generally good for creativity. They think more flexible, they're more confident in their work, and they just generally kind of perform better. Now, there is one particular instance actually when this has been bad, and this is actually when trust within the team is high. Now, that might sound a little weird given that trust can play an important role and also positive emotions can play an important role, but when you put the two together, it sort of creates some sort of issues. So when people are more trusting of each other and in a positive mood, they actually might not be willing to sort of challenge each other's ideas or discuss or bring up alternative ideas that might even indirectly challenge other people's ideas. Nobody wants to break that trust, and nobody wants to sort of take down the positive moods that people are feeling within the team. So it may lead to this state called groupthink, where everybody just sort of stays silent and nobody really challenges or kind of puts forth alternative ideas. Now, when it comes to negative moods, generally these are bad for creativity. Generally, sort of creativity is reduced and teams just don't perform as well. But there are a couple instances where it can be good. If people are working collaboratively in a group versus working alone in negative moods, they get this boost from simply just collaborating with other people. In addition to that, when there's no expectations for future interactions, this can also play a role as well. When people are in a negative mood and there's no expectations that they're going to work together again, they're not going to become as cohesive of a group and a collective unit, so that negative affect won't become quite as an issue with that collective group. In addition to that, it also helps out with idea selection. So most of the research I just discussed deals more with idea generation, not necessarily idea selection. But negative moods can kind of lead people to be more analytical and kind of pick out different themes or ideas from whatever they're working on. So it can play an important role for idea selection. But that only occurs when teams are also experiencing positive affect. So it's not necessarily just the occurrence of negative affect, it's also the experiencing both negative and positive affect at the same time. So, kind of moving into the other aspect, which deals with affective tone divergence. So this might be thought of as affective diversity, people experiencing and feeling different moods within a team. Now, there's been very little research on this sort of phenomenon, or what happens when people feel differently from one another working in a team. Some research shows it's good. When people are feeling differently, when people are in a positive mood, they're more exploring and seeing different themes or ideas emerge from whatever they're trying to learn or engage with. But negative mood people might be more analytical and kind of pick apart and try and reach some sort of more logical conclusion. So when it comes to different decision-making research, it shows that people kind of reach actually a better decision potentially when they're experiencing and feeling different moods. But it also can be sometimes bad. In one study involving top management teams and CEOs, they found that positive affective diversity, so how much they differed with positive affect, impacted whether or not they engaged in more participatory decision making, so worked together in making a decision, and also whether or not it impacted the firm's financial performance. And they did find that when there was more positive affective diversity, firm financial performance was slightly lower, and there was less participation in decision making actually. In addition, with nuclear crisis or nuclear power plant workers working on a kind of a crisis project or experience, found that they actually were less effective as a team when they had more positive affective diversity. And in one study with creativity, they found that when some people were experiencing positive moods and other people were experiencing negative moods, they actually performed worse than people all feeling the same way. And part of that was because when they would generate certain ideas, what can happen with negative moods is it leads to more of an evaluation of those ideas. And what happened is negative mood members shifted the teams to evaluate those ideas too early. So they weren't able to generate as many ideas as they would have had they all been potentially in a positive mood. And it led to a reduction in performance. So in terms of some practical implications, I'll mention two of them. One is super ties and strong ties can play a very important role in terms of the work that people engage in. They can help drive people's projects, help them get them implemented, and even just help with idea generation. But an important caveat is to remember that weak ties, or people we don't talk to as often, can play a very important role in our creativity and our innovative performance and work. In addition to that, positive affect in teams is generally better. So getting people to be more in a positive mood before kind of getting started on any creative work can be very helpful. But in terms of a caveat with that is make sure there are not aspects that might lead teams to not challenge one another, or that will lead them to kind of challenge some different ideas. Nice, respectfully, but still be willing to engage in sort of questioning ideas going forward. Now, in terms of some things we don't know, we still don't know that much about what's going on when people are feeling different moods within teams from one another. And that's still very much an area for exploration. And Zorana talked about this yesterday, but the co-occurrence of both positive and negative moods, what's called emotional ambivalence, is still very well not understood in teams as well. And on top of that, I talked at first about kind of one-on-one working relationships, and then I switched to teams. We also still don't know about how those individual relationships within teams sort of impact the whole team as well. Sort of understanding how these two people or included within about 4 or 5 other people, how that might impact performance as well. Thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions at the end, and I'll turn it over to Ronnie right now.
Good morning. So I'm going to take what Alex talked about and expand that and move from teams to leadership. But before we get to the leadership, I want to talk about some issues that we see in teams and what we know about teams and creativity. So in order to do that, I first want to talk about why we are interested in creativity in teams. Alex mentioned the survey that showed that creativity is becoming rapidly an important issue in businesses, and so does collaboration. The reason those have emerged is because we are seeing that the problems that are facing businesses today, and actually generally in society, are very complex. We kind of solved all the simple problems. We took care of them. What is left is the complex stuff. We also have a very rapidly changing environment. Technology changes fast. We have globalization. Things are moving much faster than they did. In order to respond to that, businesses need to be able to respond fast and to respond to complex problems, and that's why we want to use teams. When we use teams, we can use the diversity of the team to respond to these complex problems, and we can divide the work up to allow for a much more rapid response. So, we typically, in the team research, use what we call the IPO model, input, process, output. This has been in existence since the 60s. In our case, output is always a creative product or process or idea or solution to a problem. Just a reminder, something is creative if it's novel and useful, right? So it has to be task appropriate and solve a particular problem, but also novel. In terms of inputs, this is stuff that the team brings to the table. This is the stuff that is embedded in the team that we start with. Specifically, I want to talk about team diversity for a little bit. And then the process I want to focus on are the various social processes that are happening within the team. So when we talk about diversity, there are two broad categories that we look at. We look at demographic diversity of the team. So these are things that are usually easily observed: gender, age, race or ethnicity, nationality or culture. We see a lot more multinational teams with multinational organizations. The research on demographic diversity and creativity suggests, and this is through a meta-analysis, so it's a combination of multiple studies, that demographic diversity is unrelated to creativity. No relationship. What is related to creativity is functional diversity. Functional diversity has to do with diversity of the team based on the job or function in the organization, the department you come from, educational background, or discipline. So when I talk to companies, they like to put together diverse teams based on demographics. It's easy to do. Oh, we need a few women and some people from this racial group and that racial group and a few older folks and younger folks, with the hope of gaining creativity. But creativity does not seem to be related to demographic diversity. I do want to make a couple of caveats here with the demographic diversity. I think part of the reason it's not showing up in research, actually two reasons. One is that demographic diversity can be related to the task itself or the problem to be solved or not. So for example, there was a big discussion in the US about a couple of years ago about the fact that there are no phone apps for dealing with older population. They're just starting to come out now because the people that are developing apps are in their 20s. They're not thinking about 60-year-olds. They're not 60 themselves, nor do they have parents that are older, right? Their parents are younger. It's when it's an app developer that started this was in his mid-40s and had older parents and therefore had concerns. So demographic diversity can be beneficial if it's task-related. But when we combine across studies, some where it's task-related and some that are not, we get zero effects. The other thing is that demographic diversity has been studied as one factor at a time. So we look at age differences or gender differences. But I'm not just a female. right? And I'm not just my age, I'm both at the same time. And the studies that look at this intersection or combination of factors, I think there might be 2 or 3 of those. So it becomes very complicated, but I think that's the way we need to study it if we want to see effects on creativity. But let's focus on that functional diversity for a moment, because that really is task related. We put together a group of people that have something relevant to say about the problem at hand. So if we're putting together a new product, we want to have somebody from engineering, and we want somebody from the manufacturing plant, and we want somebody from sales, and maybe we want somebody from HR, and probably somebody from marketing, because all of those people are important for the success of the product in the end, and the sales of the product, and can influence the decisions that we make. So what are the benefits of these diverse teams? We think that diverse teams have more information. Alex talked about this even with weak ties, right? We get more information, we get more diverse information. So if I'm sitting in the room with Alex and we're very similar in terms of what we know and the context we have, we're going to have a lot of similar information. But if I sit in the room with a computer science person, all of a sudden we have a totally different network and different sources we could go to. So we get more diverse information. We get more perspectives. And we can divide the work up. Many hands make the work lighter, right? So there are cognitive benefits for these diverse teams. However, and it's a big however, diverse teams tend to have significant social deficits. We're more likely to have misunderstandings in diverse teams. I've worked in interdisciplinary teams. Sometimes we talk about the same thing using different terms, and we don't even realize it. And it can take months before we go, oh, we're talking about the same thing. Okay, we're good now. You really need to take the time to get to know each other and get to know each other's vocabulary, right? You're all speaking the same language, except it's technical language, so it's not the same language. You're more likely to get disagreements. I work with folks in the medical school. We disagree about how to analyze data and what statistical tools to use, because what's conventional for them is not conventional in psychology, and vice versa, right? So trying to figure that out. All of those result, as I said, in process deficits. It can result in low trust. It can result in increased conflict. And those are negative emotions, right? So we talked about negative emotions. The weaknesses in these diverse teams tend to result in negative emotions, which can be problematic for creativity. And I'm saying can be. So let's shift to talking about the leader and what leaders can do. And one of the things that we find is that leaders are critically important for making sure that teams work well together and they manage the social process. Okay? So they create this climate for creativity where there is support for creativity and psychological safety. And I want to talk a little bit more about psychological safety, which I personally have I've come to understand, or my current view is that psychological safety is this overarching concept that facilitates effective social processes. So what is psychological safety first? It is a feeling or perception of being accepted and respected in the team. This feeling that you can take risks. And it's been found to be related to creativity and innovation. Now, specifically, what do we know from psychological safety research? There's been quite a bit of research in the last 10 years or so. We find that it increases knowledge sharing in teams. So psychologically safe teams are also teams where people team members feel comfortable sharing information, sharing knowledge. It relates to motivation and willingness to be creative. So if you feel psychologically safe, you're more motivated to be creative, you're more willing to be creative in a team. It increases reflection in a team. So team reflexivity, this notion that we think about what went well, what didn't go well, how we can change things so they go better in the future, are particularly important for these teams that work together for a period of time. And as a result, it facilitates learning from mistakes. And it allows teams to integrate conflicting views. So if you have a diverse team and you have this notion of, oh, I'm bringing something and you disagree with me because you do it in a different way, how do we put these two together? Well, it allows us, through psychological safety, we can safely discuss this and find a way to integrate conflicting views. All of those are the reason why psychological safety results in increased creativity. Recently, maybe about a year ago, Google came out with this famous study of 180 teams. I think it sounded like they've discovered something new. They really didn't. What they found was their own internal study of their own teams. Those teams that had high psychological safety were also their most productive teams and most creative teams. Interestingly, and this piece was new to me, was that individuals in those teams, when you feel psychologically safe, you do not want to leave the team. You tend to stay, which for organizations can be really important. If you have valuable members leaving, that's not good. So when we talk about psychological safety, there's a lot of misconception about what psychological safety is. So I said it's feeling respected and being willing to take risks in the team. It does not mean that you have to be nice, okay? Being nice for the sake of being nice and not having any disagreements because we don't want to rock the boat is not psychological safety. Psychological safety, to borrow from Zorana's presentation yesterday, has this mix of both positive and negative. The positive is this feeling of acceptance, right? And being nice. But the negative is we have to have disagreements. Psychological safety allows us to have those disagreements, and it's useful. But we need to know how to disagree, how to do it well, how to do it respectfully. And that's what psychological safety is all about. And it has this mix of positive and negative emotions because of that. So psychological safety allows team members to engage in an open discussion. That's exactly what we want. We want people to criticize each other in a constructive way. If I bring up an idea and it's crazy, I want my team members to tell me it's a crazy idea and tell me how we can make it better. We want people to suggest creative ideas. If they're too nervous because they're feeling that they will be criticized too harshly, they're not going to bring it up. It allows people to disagree, but in a respectful and constructive manner, which again facilitates creativity. It allows people to ask questions. Okay, so you brought up this idea, but what about this? Did you think about how we would implement it? It allows people to admit mistakes and therefore learn and grow from previous experiences. So what can leaders do? How can leaders promote psychological safety in the team? And leaders have a very important role. Leaders can help the team develop respect for different opinions. One thing that leaders can do is role modeling, right? So if somebody brings a different opinion, so we're sitting in my lab and somebody says something that I may not agree with, well, I can make fun of them, I can tell them they're wrong. I can call them an idiot. There are all kinds of ways I can react. Ideally, what I should do as a leader is say something like, tell me more about this. I want to hear. Okay, this is an interesting point. How does it work with what we've talked about so far? What sort of support from the literature do you have for this point of view? And that would make my team see that this is the appropriate way to have a conversation and disagree. My students will then be more likely to voice their disagreements if I am respectful towards someone that disagrees with me. They're also more likely to disagree respectfully with each other. A leader can also promote open communication a number of ways. You know, a lot of teams have somebody that's very dominant. Well, part of the role of the leader is to make sure that person is not so dominant. And there are, again, respectful ways of doing that. You don't just tell that person to shut up. You just say, maybe, you know, okay, we've heard your point. Let's hear what other people have to say. The leader needs to draw out those people that are quiet. You have something to say. We want to hear your opinion. Make sure that as a leader, you hear everybody in the group. We also find that when diversity of thought is viewed as important in the team, that is viewed as something that is desirable, those teams tend to have psychological safety, open conversations, and so forth. So the leader is a really critical part of telling the team and explaining to the team why this diversity of thought is important. And remember, leaders need to not just talk, they need to do. Because if I say it's important, but then my behavior suggests that it's not going to happen. Leaders promote collaboration. Okay? Leaders can promote collaboration by facilitating interaction. So, for example, as a faculty member, I may tell one of my students, you know, I really think you need to contact this person, maybe in a different department. So I have these relationships that I can then suggest to the team to go and further promote. So it's not just within the team, it's across other teams, other departments, other organizations. They can facilitate information sharing within the team, again, by facilitating this open discussion, by making sure that everybody's point of view is being heard. The leaders themselves should not dominate the conversation either. Finally, leaders create a positive climate that supports creativity, and one of the most important parts of that is a climate of learning. One of the things that we see when we look at organizations that are particularly creative, we find that they don't talk about mistakes. They don't talk about, or they talk about mistakes, they don't talk about failure. Creative ideas are risky ideas. Creative ideas are new. We haven't tried them before. We don't know if they would work. Most creative ideas fail. They do not succeed. As a result, it's really important how the organization and leadership within the organization treats those failures. So for example, a company like Gore-Tex, who's very well known for their creative efforts, they don't talk about failure. Learning opportunities is what they call them, right? So it's not a failure. I can take the risk because I don't fail. I learned from it. And the question is not, we don't assign blame. Oh, you're responsible for the fact the company lost $1 million. No. We know that's part of what happens. We know that we will have some losses. We're going to talk about what we learned from this, how we're going to do things better or differently, or now we know that this doesn't work. Okay, check, right? We don't assign blame, we learn from our mistakes, and we reduce the risk of team members from taking those risks by not assigning blame and not calling them failures, okay? So, And with that, I am done. I never know. Oh, yeah.